July 9th, 1944, northern Saipan. The jungle was quiet now, too quiet for a place that had burned for 3 weeks straight. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, clinging to the wet leaves and the rusting wreckage of tanks that no longer moved. American medics advanced cautiously through the rubble of what once had been a Japanese field hospital, a low concrete bunker half collapsed from naval bombardment. Inside, beneath twisted beams and smoke-stained walls, the flicker of a flashlight caught the trembling face of a young Japanese officer, a woman no older than 24, her khaki uniform torn, her arm shredded by shrapnel. Around her, other women in faded imperial armbands lay silent, clutching one another, waiting for what they believed would be execution. But instead of the gunshots they braced for, came a different sound, the soft tearing of gauze. The gentle voice of an American nurse saying, almost to herself, "Easy now. You'll be all right." The women froze. Some looked away in disbelief. For the first time, they saw mercy from the enemy they had been told would destroy them. That single act, a wound bandaged, a kindness offered, would echo far beyond Saipan. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered its most merciless stage. The island-hopping campaign launched by the United States had pushed the Japanese Empire back from its outer defensive ring. From Tarawa to Kwajalein, the once proud imperial banners had been reduced to ash. Each new island captured brought American bombers closer to Japan's home shores, and with it, a deeper sense of dread among the Japanese people. On the island of Saipan, that dread became prophecy. Saipan was more than a tropical outpost. It was part of Japan's inner defense line, only 1,500 miles from Tokyo. When U.S. Marines landed there on June 15, 1944, they were not just fighting soldiers. They were fighting an idea. The Imperial Japanese Army had infused every man, woman, and even child with a single doctrine: death before surrender. Among the defenders were not only soldiers, but also female officers and auxiliaries from the Women's Volunteer Nursing Corps and the Imperial Army Nurse Association. Many were trained as medical assistants or clerks. Others carried rifles and grenades. They had been told that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that American troops would torture and defile them. That belief was no accident. For years, Japanese wartime propaganda had portrayed the enemy as monsters, soulless invaders bent on annihilation. Government-issued pamphlets urged soldiers and civilians alike to commit suicide rather than fall into Allied hands. This ideology, rooted in the ancient code of Bushido, had been twisted into a national death sentence. To surrender was to bring eternal shame to one's ancestors. Inside the caves and tunnels of Saipan, this belief hardened into collective madness. Entire families leapt from cliffs rather than be taken alive. Even nurses carried grenades close to their hearts, ready to die when the Americans arrived. For them, surrender was unimaginable, until the moment they were too wounded to die. When the American assault reached the island's interior, the U.S. Army Medical Corps encountered hundreds of wounded Japanese, many of them women. Most were terrified, delirious, and unable to comprehend why their captors offered water instead of a bullet. To the Americans, it was simply duty. To the Japanese, it was unthinkable. At this stage of the war, the U.S. military's medical doctrine was grounded in both practicality and ethics. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had set expectations for the humane treatment of prisoners, though Japan had never ratified it. Still, American commanders emphasized that medical aid be provided to all wounded personnel, regardless of uniform. The frontline medics and nurses who followed. This order often did so at great personal risk, entering caves, filled with explosives or approaching bodies that might still hold grenades. The nurses themselves were a story of courage. Members of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, often in their 20s, served in canvas field hospitals under artillery fire. They were trained not to discriminate between friend and foe. In Saipan, these nurses encountered the first large numbers of Japanese women captured alive, and what they saw challenged everything they'd been told about their enemy. 2. When American nurses knelt beside bleeding Japanese officers, they noticed the same trembling hands, the same desperate eyes as their own patients. Some Japanese women tried to resist help, turning their faces away, whispering prayers. Others fainted when an American hand touched theirs. One medic later wrote in his journal, "They were more frightened of kindness than of pain." This quiet reversal, the invader becoming the caretaker, marked a psychological turning point in the Pacific War's human story. Beneath the wreckage of empire and ideology, an unexpected truth emerged. Compassion was stronger than propaganda. In the days that followed, captured Japanese women began to witness what their superiors had denied them: that the Americans they feared were not demons, but men and women exhausted by the same war, desperate to preserve life where they could. And as Saipan fell, the survivors, both Japanese and American, would carry that moment with them into the next brutal stage of the Pacific Campaign. The lessons of Saipan would echo again less than a year later, on another island soaked in blood and disbelief. By the time Okinawa became the next battlefield in April 1945, the human toll of the Pacific War had reached unimaginable levels. Japan was desperate. With its naval power shattered and its air forces depleted, the Imperial Command turned to the population itself. Men, women, and even schoolgirls were mobilized to defend the homeland. Among them were the Himayuri students, young women trained as wartime nurses. They were barely out of school when they were sent to underground field hospitals dug beneath the limestone hills of Okinawa. There, under constant bombardment, they tended to mangled soldiers and civilians alike, their only light coming from flickering oil lamps. By now, the American advance was unstoppable. U.S. forces, hardened by years of island warfare, were backed by superior logistics, technology, and medical infrastructure. Their doctrine was clear: every life mattered, even the enemy's. To them, saving a life wasn't an act of mercy. It was part of the mission. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps had become one of the most disciplined and efficient medical units in the world. Operating mobile field hospitals, surgical tents, and evacuation systems, these nurses worked alongside medics and surgeons, often just yards from the front line. Many wore the same mud and fear as the soldiers they treated. When the first waves of casualties arrived at the field hospitals near Naha and Itomen, the Americans were prepared for thousands of wounded, but not for what they found underground. Hidden within the maze of Okinawa's caves were hundreds of Japanese female personnel, including nurses, clerks, and communication officers, many in critical condition. Some had been burned by explosions, others had shrapnel wounds left untreated for days. The stench of infection filled the air. When American medics entered these caves, they did so with their rifles lowered and their medkits open. They didn't know if the wounded would surrender or detonate grenades. But the war's cruelty was met that day with something radically simple: the will to heal. One American Red Cross nurse later recalled, "They couldn't believe we were there to help. Their faces? Terror at first, then disbelief, then something like shame. It was as if the world they knew had collapsed, and only this strange mercy remained." To the Japanese, this compassion was psychologically devastating. Their indoctrination had promised that capture meant humiliation. Instead, they found themselves fed, washed, and treated with dignity. Some tried to refuse treatment, whispering apologies to their fallen comrades. Others broke down crying when bandaged by American hands. The U.S. medical teams documented everything. Reports filed from Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa describe dozens of cases where Japanese prisoners, including women, were given the same care as Allied soldiers. In one dispatch from the 10th Army Medical Department, a note read simply, "Enemy wounded, treated without distinction." This policy was not born of idealism alone. It was strategic, moral, and psychological. Saving enemy lives meant gathering intelligence, undermining morale, and upholding the moral high ground in a war defined by atrocities. Every bandaged wound was also a message that America fought not just to defeat Japan, but to prove a different kind of strength. Meanwhile, within the Imperial High Command, the notion of such mercy was considered treasonous. Japanese officers who surrendered or were captured were erased from military records. Their families back home often never learned they were alive. The war's propaganda machine demanded that its citizens believe the Americans were monsters, for without that fear, Japan's collapsing defense could not hold. Yet, as the war drew to its brutal conclusion, that illusion crumbled with every captured hospital, every treated prisoner, and every act of kindness that defied orders on both sides. By August 1945, Japan's medical corps lay in ruins. Thousands of its nurses and auxiliaries had perished, many by suicide. Those who survived, especially the women treated by Americans, became living contradictions to everything they had been taught. And it was within this moral collision between mercy and indoctrination, compassion and conquest, that the most revealing human stories of the Pacific War would emerge. The war had stripped away nearly everything that made people human: nationality, gender, mercy. Yet, in those dim, makeshift hospitals scattered across Saipan and Okinawa, the human spirit flickered quietly back to life. For many Japanese female officers and nurses, capture was an experience worse than any battlefield wound. Raised under the doctrine of Gyokusai, the honorable death, they were taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. They had rehearsed suicide drills, memorized prayers, even carried grenades wrapped in silk to use on themselves if captured. But when American medics approached them, bleeding and broken, what they faced was not cruelty, but confusion, a confusion of humanity. Witness accounts describe Japanese women trembling violently when touched, covering their faces as if awaiting a fatal blow. Instead, they felt antiseptic on their skin, gauze on their wounds, and a foreign voice murmuring calm reassurance. One Army surgeon, Captain Robert Miller, noted in his field diary, "They would not look at us." One young woman whispered, "Why?" over and over. "We had no answer but to keep working." These moments weren't grand gestures of peace. They were small, wordless acts that shattered indoctrination. For the first time, Japanese women who had been told Americans were beasts discovered a truth that shook them more than defeat. The enemy was capable of compassion. And for the Americans, these encounters forced a different kind of reckoning. Many nurses had lost brothers or fiancés in the Pacific. Yet when faced with an enemy bleeding before them, the instinct to heal overcame vengeance. It wasn't forgiveness. It was professionalism. Humanity stripped to its core. That silent exchange of mercy across the enemy line became, in its own way, an act of defiance against the brutality that had defined the war. Frontline medics lived at the edge of chaos. Between artillery barrages and sniper fire, their mission was brutally simple: save whoever could still be saved. The Pacific Islands turned that principle into a nightmare. The terrain was merciless: dense jungle, volcanic rock, endless rain. Japanese soldiers used the geography to their advantage, burrowing into tunnels and caves that became both fortresses and tombs. When Americans advanced, they often found these caves filled with a mix of wounded soldiers and civilians, women among them, many still armed. It was in these tense moments that battlefield ethics met reality. Medics couldn't always tell who was a threat. There were documented cases where wounded Japanese soldiers detonated grenades as rescuers approached. Yet despite these dangers, American medical units continued to treat enemy casualties. driven by their field code. You never step over a man who's still breathing. This tactical discipline saved lives and built unexpected intelligence opportunities. In several Pacific operations, wounded Japanese officers provided valuable information once stabilized. More importantly, every act of humane treatment undermined Japanese propaganda that depicted Americans as barbaric invaders. Reports from the 2nd Marine Division on Saipan recorded instances where wounded Japanese, after being treated, persuaded others to surrender. In one case, a female medical clerk, treated for burns, convinced a group of civilians to leave a cave and accept aid. Her quiet words, delivered through pain, spared dozens of lives. Behind every such act lay the unseen cost. American medics and nurses working beyond exhaustion, their tents overflowing with the wounded from both sides. They didn't have time for politics or hate. They worked by the rhythm of triage, who could be saved and who couldn't. Mercy, in this sense, wasn't just moral, it was operational. It helped end fights sooner, reduced suicides, and kept a small pocket of sanity in a war gone mad. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps had entered World War II as a force of 1,000. By 1945, it numbered more than 50,000. Their mission stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific. But nowhere was their work as morally complex as in the islands of Japan's collapsing empire. In those field hospitals, medical neutrality became a quiet weapon of civilization. American doctors treated Japanese prisoners with the same surgical precision they gave their own. There were no exceptions. Gangrenous wounds were cleaned, limbs amputated, fevers broken. The same morphine syringe that eased an American Marine's agony was used for a Japanese sergeant minutes later. Such actions didn't go unnoticed. American officers wrote home about it, often in disbelief. You patch them up, and they bow. I don't know what to feel anymore. The Red Cross played a crucial supporting role, delivering medical supplies and overseeing prisoner care when possible. On islands like Guam and Peleliu, American nurses were often the first women Japanese POWs had seen who weren't wearing a uniform, a sight that, for many, symbolized something long forgotten. Normalcy. In treating their enemies, these nurses also treated themselves, reclaiming a sense of purpose amid destruction. They saw beyond the uniform, beyond the war, and recognized the simplest truth of all, that life, however fragile, was worth saving. By war's end, tens of thousands of enemy wounded had passed through American hands. Some survived to tell their stories in post-war Japan, describing how the enemy they feared most had preserved their lives. Those testimonies became seeds of reconciliation. Quiet, often anonymous, but deeply human. War shapes the mind as much as it wounds the body. In the Pacific, no ideology was more consuming than Japan's wartime creed of honor through death. From an early age, citizens were taught that surrender was unthinkable, a moral suicide worse than physical death. For Japan's female auxiliaries and officers, this indoctrination ran deep. Their schools were filled with patriotic songs about sacrifice. Their training manuals preached purity and devotion to the emperor. They were expected to heal soldiers, not to be healed themselves. The idea that an enemy nurse could offer them comfort was not just foreign. It was psychologically unbearable. When these women awoke in American medical tents, surrounded by white sheets and strange voices, the emotional collapse was often immediate. Many survivors later recalled the feeling of dissonance, their bodies being saved while their identity, their very belief system, shattered. One post-war Japanese report described it simply, "They cried not because of pain, but because kindness was too heavy to bear." For the American caregivers, this dissonance had its own mirror effect. They had been trained to dehumanize the Japanese enemy through propaganda films, training posters, and years of loss. Yet when faced with a wounded woman barely out of girlhood, the illusion of difference fell away. This mutual unmasking, the loss of ideology on both sides, revealed something profound about warfare. Brutality may win territory, but mercy conquers conviction. In a conflict fueled by fear, the act of healing became a form of quiet rebellion, a moment where humanity itself refused to surrender. By 1945, both sides had committed atrocities that scarred generations. The firebombing of Tokyo, the massacres in Nanking, the kamikaze waves. Mercy had become a luxury neither army expected. Yet amid that moral collapse, the medical wards became the last refuge of principle. To the American nurses, binding a Japanese wound wasn't just protocol, it was defiance. It was a statement that their cause stood for something greater than revenge. The U.S. Army Medical Corps operated under one rule that transcended orders. You treat the wounded as you find them. In practice, that meant saving lives that many soldiers wished to see ended. There were moments when rage boiled over. A nurse treating the man who had shot her friend, a medic helping a soldier who moments earlier had killed Americans. But professionalism held firm. Lieutenant Ann Carmichael, stationed in the Pacific in 1945, later said, "If we had lost our humanity, then what exactly were we fighting for?" On the other side, captured Japanese nurses who survived often carried deep guilt. Many wrote in diaries smuggled home after the war, describing the unbearable paradox of being treated kindly by the enemy while their own command had demanded self-destruction. These moral collisions became invisible threads, connecting two worlds. They didn't make headlines or appear in victory parades, but in those field hospitals, moral courage was redefined. Compassion, in this sense, wasn't weakness. It was the strongest act of resistance possible in a time when everything around them demanded hatred. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japan was a nation in ruins, its cities burned, its armies broken, and its people traumatized. But out of that devastation came quiet stories that defied the darkness. Some of the Japanese women treated by American nurses on Saipan and Okinawa were later repatriated through Red Cross operations. They returned to a society that often refused to acknowledge them. Captured soldiers, even if female, were seen as disgraced. Yet many carried with them a memory that refused to fade. The touch of a foreign nurse, the moment they realized the world was larger than propaganda had allowed. In post-war Japan, as hospitals reopened and medical schools were rebuilt under Allied supervision, these women became part of a new cultural awakening. Some pursued nursing themselves, inspired by what they had seen. Others spoke quietly to their families, telling their children that the Americans they feared had once saved them. Those small retellings, whispered in kitchens and classrooms, slowly eroded decades of indoctrination. The image of the American as a merciless invader gave way, in some corners, to that of a reluctant human being. From these experiences emerged the foundations of post-war Japan's humanitarian identity, the country that would later lead in medical innovation, disaster response, and peacekeeping. It is no coincidence that Japan's modern nursing culture emphasizes compassion as a national virtue. The seed was planted in war, in pain, and in mercy. In those final months of the Pacific conflict, when blood and ideology ruled the world, a few quiet hands, American and Japanese alike, proved that even on the battlefield, empathy could rewrite history's tone. From these layered perspectives, human, tactical, medical, psychological, moral, and cultural, one truth stands firm. The most radical act of the Pacific War was not destruction, but kindness. And as the war's fury reached its breaking point, that truth would be tested in its most violent confrontation yet. Okinawa. Rain fell endlessly over the island, mixing with mud, smoke, and blood. The Battle of Okinawa would become the costliest campaign of the Pacific, a brutal, grinding storm that swallowed more than 250,000 lives in just 3 months. For the Japanese, Okinawa was not merely another outpost. It was the final barrier before the home islands. For the Americans, it was the gateway to victory, the last step before a possible invasion of Japan itself. Every hill, every ridge, every cave became a line of desperation. Amid the chaos, the underground hospitals beneath Shuri Castle became scenes of unspeakable horror. Inside, hundreds of Japanese wounded lay in the dark, tended by young women who had stopped expecting rescue. The nurses, many still teenagers, had been ordered to stay behind, to comfort the dying, and then take their own lives when the Americans arrived. The bombardment above was constant. The ground shook so violently that lamps shattered, plunging the tunnels into darkness. The air was thick with smoke, infection, and the smell of burned flesh. When the shelling stopped, it was not silence that followed, but footsteps. American medics and infantrymen, moving through the ruins, discovered the entrances to several of these caves. Their orders were clear: clear the tunnels, search for survivors, and treat any wounded. What they found were scenes that defied imagination. Wounded Japanese soldiers, nurses covered in soot and blood, and civilians clinging to life. Most resisted aid. Some tried to take their lives. Others, delirious, begged for death, but in one of the caves, later recorded in the U.S. 10th Army's field report, an encounter took place that symbolized the moral turning point of the Pacific. A small group of American medics entered a chamber, lined with makeshift cots. There, among the debris, lay several Japanese women in tattered uniforms, the remains of a medical detachment. One of them, a lieutenant, was conscious but badly burned. When the first medic approached, she turned her face away, whispering something they didn't understand. Expecting resistance, the Americans hesitated. But then a nurse, Army Nurse Corps Lieutenant Ruth Morgan, knelt beside her. Slowly, she reached for the woman's bandaged arm and began to unwrap it. The Japanese officer flinched but didn't pull away. When Ruth cleaned the wound and began to rebandage it, the woman's composure broke. She began to cry quietly, not from pain, but from disbelief. Her tears fell onto the nurse's hands, blackened with ash and iodine. Another medic wrote later in his log, "She looked at us as if we were ghosts, and maybe we were, to her. Ghosts of a world she never thought existed." Word of these moments spread quickly among American units. Soldiers who had spent months fighting an enemy that refused to surrender now saw something they hadn't expected. The human face of the war they thought was faceless. Even hardened Marines, men who had survived Tarawa and Peleliu, stood silent when wounded Japanese women were carried into their tents. One sergeant recalled seeing a young nurse, her uniform shredded, clutching a small notebook covered in dried blood. Inside were lists of her patients, all dead, he later said. "We realized then that they were fighting for the same thing we were, to save their own." As the fighting dragged on, American hospitals on Okinawa filled with both Allied and Japanese wounded. The same surgical tables that treated Marines were used for captured nurses and soldiers. The distinction between sides blurred under the white glare of operating lamps. The Battle of Okinawa was one of annihilation. Yet within it, these acts of compassion became the last moral resistance against total collapse. For many American medics and nurses, this battle marked the moment they understood the full meaning of their duty. Amid the firestorms and fanatical last stands, they found themselves not merely witnesses to destruction, but keepers of humanity. One nurse later told a reporter, "You stop seeing sides. You just see suffering. And when you stop hating, that's when the war finally begins to end." By June, the island was declared secured. But victory came at an unbearable price. Entire Japanese units had been wiped out. Civilians lay dead by the tens of thousands. The caves were filled with the unburied. And yet, among the few who survived, the women treated, the nurses saved, the memory of that unexpected mercy would linger long after the guns fell silent. They had seen the face of an enemy who healed, rather than killed, and it changed them forever. The rain that soaked Okinawa in the spring of 1945 carried more than water. It carried the smell of a nation's end. By mid-June, Japanese command had collapsed into chaos. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Army, knew the defense was doomed. He ordered his men to fight to the last. But deep inside Shuri's caves, the surviving nurses and medics faced a different command. One more tragic. They were told not to be captured alive. The Himayuri Student Corps, young women mobilized as field nurses, were among those hiding in the labyrinth below. Many had already watched their classmates die from shell fire or suicide grenades. Yet when American troops finally reached their tunnels, what happened next was something no one had anticipated. The Americans didn't come with bayonets raised. They came with stretchers, canteens, and morphine. In one surviving account from U.S. medic John D. Peterson, his platoon stumbled upon a group of 15 Japanese women, exhausted, starving, and terrified. One of them, her arm shattered, kept repeating a phrase Peterson didn't understand. Only later did a captured interpreter explain it. "Please, don't touch us." They believed American soldiers tortured and mutilated captives. Instead, the medics began treating them. They cleaned wounds, applied salves, gave water. When one nurse fainted from blood loss, a U.S. corpsman carried her to the nearest field station on his back. The scene defied every image both sides had been fed. Nearby, the 77th Infantry Division had set up a temporary hospital tent. Within hours, Japanese women, soldiers, civilians, nurses, lay on the same cots as wounded Americans. Many of the U.S. nurses hesitated at first, unsure whether they were breaking rules. But higher command eventually ordered, "Treat them. They're human beings." That order, simple as it was, marked the moral summit of Okinawa. Inside those tents, the atmosphere shifted. The language barrier dissolved through gestures, nods, and touch. American nurses spoke softly, using tone more than words. They changed dressings, adjusted splints, and fed the weak with spoons of watery broth. The Japanese women, whose entire wartime education painted the Americans as monsters, found themselves trembling not from fear, but from confusion. For the first time, they were treated with gentleness. One captured Japanese nurse, Lieutenant Junko Higa, would later tell an interviewer after the war, "I could not understand why the enemy was so kind. We had been told they would kill us slowly, but they did not. They treated us as if our lives mattered." Those who could not comprehend English understood something far greater: compassion, a language that crossed ideology. Meanwhile, outside the tents, the war's final horror unfolded. On June 21st, General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, committed ritual suicide on the southern cliffs of Okinawa. With their deaths, the island's defense effectively ended. The following morning, the sounds of organized resistance faded, replaced by the wind and the cries of the wounded. That same morning, an American nurse wrote in her journal, "We patched up those who had sworn to die for their emperor. Some refused our food, others bowed their heads and cried when we touched them. I don't know who won today, but I know the killing finally stopped." By late June, over 7,400 Japanese soldiers and civilians had been taken prisoner, one of the largest surrenders in the Pacific War. Many of them were treated in Allied medical stations, and among the survivors, the female officers and nurses who had once sworn never to surrender began to face an internal reckoning. Their world, built on the belief that mercy was weakness, had collapsed before their eyes. A few months later, After the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender, some of these women would be repatriated through Okinawa, or Guam. U.S. military records describe scenes of quiet gratitude. Japanese nurses bowing deeply before the American medics who had once bandaged them. One even wrote a thank you note in broken English before leaving, "I live because enemy was kind. I never forget." For the Americans, too, those moments left a mark. Combat-hardened soldiers who had seen the worst of humanity. On Saipan and Iwo Jima found something almost redemptive in those final weeks, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Tuwing Fiha Fain. Battle of Okinawa was still the deadliest of the Pacific, with entire villages erased and over 12,000 American dead. Yet, within that slaughter, the image of a U.S. nurse bending over a Japanese officer's wounds stood as a quiet rebellion against the brutality of war. It was proof that compassion could survive even in the deepest pit of violence. As in I to Tuaner Surstudder, Sutantantardins, the last evacuation ships departed Okinawa. The nurses who had survived, both American and Japanese, carried scars that would never fully heal. But they also carried a shared truth, that kindness, once shown, could break the hardest propaganda, the deepest hatred, and the most unshakable obedience. For the Japanese women officers who had wept under American care, it was not defeat that they felt. It was awakening. And for the Americans who offered it, it was not triumph, but a rediscovery of humanity in the ashes of victory. That revelation would echo into the post-war years, shaping how both nations remembered what it meant to be enemies and what it meant to stop being one. When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa, the island resembled another planet, stripped of color, torn open by artillery, and scattered with thousands of bodies that no one could yet bury. In the humid stillness that followed, the real war, the one for survival, decency, and identity, began. The U.S. Army Medical Corps and Navy hospital units established sprawling makeshift hospitals across Okinawa's ravaged southern plains. Field tents stitched with mud and blood became sanctuaries not just for wounded Americans, but for the captured and the condemned, Japanese soldiers, civilians, and female officers who had once vowed to die before capture. Among them were the Himeyuri nurses and other Imperial Army women who had endured the caves of Hebaru and Shuri. Some were barely recognizable, their uniforms shredded, their faces blackened by smoke, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. Yet, to the astonishment of their own commanders, many were alive precisely because American nurses and medics had refused to let them die. For the Americans, this presented a profound contradiction. They had just fought one of the most brutal battles in the Pacific, losing friends in close combat against soldiers who never surrendered. Yet now, these same soldiers lay helpless before them, no longer fanatics, just frightened human beings. Official records from the U.S. 10th Army's Medical Department described the strange atmosphere that followed. Japanese wounded expressed disbelief when provided food and medical attention. Many refused treatment at first, later accepting it in silence. The compassion that followed was not policy. It was instinct. The American nurses, exhausted from weeks of triage, began to record what they saw. One wrote, "Their faces change when we touch them. It's as if they've been told their whole lives not to believe in mercy." What emerged in those tents was something unplanned. A quiet reconciliation born in bandages and morphine. It was the opposite of every image that wartime propaganda had built. For Japanese female officers, trained in loyalty to the emperor and contempt for surrender, the experience was shattering. Many had been indoctrinated to view capture as the ultimate disgrace. Yet they found themselves being cleaned, fed, and spoken to gently by those they had been taught to hate. Some of the American nurses noticed small changes. The women began bowing before treatment, whispering arigato, even when they could barely move. A few, once strong and defiant, cried silently as their wounds were redressed. At the same time, the U.S. command had to decide how to handle this new category of prisoner: female military personnel who were both combatants and caregivers. They were interrogated carefully but treated according to the Geneva Convention, a gesture that surprised even senior Japanese officers. When the first photographs of these scenes reached Allied headquarters, they quietly circulated through press briefings and morale divisions. They were not shown publicly. The images of American women tending to Japanese officers were deemed too sensitive during wartime. But within the ranks, they became whispered symbols of moral strength. One officer later remarked, "We won Okinawa not only with bullets, but by refusing to become the enemy we fought." Meanwhile, the surviving Japanese nurses began to write diaries in secret. They chronicled the pain, the shame, and the confusion of being saved by the Americans. Those diaries, preserved decades later in Japanese museums, describe the strange intimacy of being healed by one's conqueror. Their hands smelled of soap and tobacco. When they touched me, I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. In those fragments of memory, the boundary between victory and defeat blurred. The war in the Pacific still raged. Tokyo had not yet burned. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still standing. But on Okinawa, something irreversible had already happened. The psychological war, the one built on hate and dehumanization, had begun to crumble. The same nurses who once swore to die now owed their lives to the enemy. The same Americans who swore never to pity the Japanese were now saving them. It was a quiet, moral victory, unseen in newsreels or military briefings, but it was perhaps the most human moment of the entire Pacific campaign. In the months that followed the Battle of Okinawa, the once shattered island transformed into a vast hospital. American tents stretched from the beaches to the highlands, filled with the wounded of both nations. And amid that slow healing, a strange coexistence began to emerge. One built on necessity, but softened by empathy. For many Japanese women officers and nurses, this period marked their first extended contact with Americans outside of combat. The war had ended for them the moment they were pulled from the ruins, but psychologically, they were still at war, with their pride, their training, and their fear of disgrace. Reports from the U.S. Army Medical Department, Pacific Theater, noted that female Japanese POWs were disciplined, quiet, and reluctant to speak, yet deeply responsive to kindness. American doctors often described their behavior as ceremonial, with small bows given for every bandage changed. What the reports didn't capture was the internal unraveling happening within those women. Years of militarist indoctrination, of Yamato Damashi, the unyielding Japanese spirit, had taught them that surrender erased honor. Yet now, lying in Allied infirmaries, they witnessed something that defied the imperial code entirely: mercy without expectation. As weeks passed, their distrust began to fracture. Some of the women asked to assist American nurses in treating other Japanese wounded, translating where they could, or helping carry water. Slowly, the U.S. medics allowed it. There were no formal agreements, just silent cooperation born of exhaustion and shared humanity. One American nurse later recalled a moment that stayed with her for life. A young Japanese lieutenant helped me carry a bucket of disinfectant. Her hands shook, but she smiled. That was the first time I realized she was no different from me. By late summer 1945, news of Japan's surrender reached the island. The surviving Japanese officers and medical staff, now POWs, gathered under the same gray tarps where they had once been treated. Some wept openly. Others stared into the ground, unable to reconcile defeat with survival. When the repatriation process began months later, Hundreds of Japanese women, soldiers, nurses, and volunteers were transported from Okinawa to Japan aboard U.S. hospital ships. These ships, once instruments of war, now carried something fragile: reconciliation. Witnesses recalled how American nurses helped the Japanese disembark, adjusting their blankets, guiding them to the decks so they could see their homeland again. The women bowed in silence. For many, it was their first glimpse of peace in years. In the months that followed Japan's formal surrender, stories of these encounters began surfacing in military journals and oral histories. U.S. war correspondents wrote quietly of a strange peace born among the wounded. In Japan, former imperial nurses described the Americans not as enemies, but as paradoxes. The ones who killed our comrades, but saved our lives. When occupation forces entered Tokyo later that year, many of the nurses from Okinawa were reassigned to assist in rebuilding Japan's broken hospitals. Some even worked under Allied supervision, applying techniques they had learned from their American caretakers. Their first-hand experience with modern field medicine became part of the foundation of Japan's post-war healthcare system. The psychological transformation was deeper still. Those who survived never forgot the sound of English voices speaking softly in the midst of ruin. In post-war interviews decades later, several Japanese women veterans said the same thing in different words. The Americans defeated us, but they did not destroy us. For the U.S. medics and nurses, those memories endured as well. Many had entered the Pacific believing mercy had no place in war. They left believing the opposite, that compassion was the only thing that kept them human. When historian George Pfeiffer later wrote about Okinawa, he called it the war's bloodiest and its most merciful moment, proof that humanity can survive even when nations cannot. The marred legacy of those field hospitals, where American nurses bandaged Japanese officers and enemy, hands reached for one another, would outlast the empire that began the Taituki War. The battle ended in devastation, but within that devastation lay a quiet victory that history rarely celebrates. The triumph of empathy over vengeance, and from that fragile mercy would emerge the first fragile bonds of peace. The kind born not from treaties or speeches, but from the steady hands that refused to let another human being die needlessly. In the long memory of World War II, the world often remembers the explosions, not the silence that followed. Yet, on the charred hills of Okinawa and the ruined wards of Saipan, it was silence that told the truer story. A silence filled with the slow breathing of the wounded, the soft rustle of gauze, and the quiet defiance of compassion. Daigi, image of American nurses tending to Japanese female officers, remains one of the most haunting contrasts of the Pacific War. These were women who had been trained to despise surrender, to embrace death before dishonor. And yet, when the end came, it was not dishonor that found them, but grace. To the Americans, their act of mercy was not a gesture of weakness, but of strength. In the darkest corner of a merciless war, they refused to become what they fought against. Every bandage laid across an enemy's wound was, in its own way, an act of resistance against hatred, against propaganda, against the belief that humanity could be erased by uniform or flag. For the Japanese women, the moment of being healed by the enemy shattered everything they had been taught about loyalty, purity, and fear. In that shock, that trembling realization that the enemy could be gentle, something profound happened. The war did not just end on the battlefield, it ended in their hearts. When those women returned home, they carried with them more than scars. They carried the memory of a kindness they could neither explain nor forget, a memory that quietly undermined decades of militarist myth. And so, the story of the American nurses and the Japanese women they saved is not one of conquest or defeat. It is the story of how, Amid the greatest cruelty of the modern age, a few hands reached across the rubble and proved that humanity itself had survived. In that fragile, fleeting mercy, the war, for a brief and unforgettable moment, became something more than destruction. It became redemption.